Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
It's a great privilege now to introduce Dr. Tim Mawson, who is a fellow in philosophy at St Peter's College, Oxford. He was an undergraduate at St Peter's and then did your doctorate at Queen's?
Yes.
The Queen's College, Oxford. Has remained in Oxford in various colleges and migrated back to St Peter's as one of their two fellows in philosophy. He has a particular interest, I think I can say, looking at your long list of publications in philosophy of religion, subjects such as ethics and morality. There's a paper there on theodicy, all sorts of interesting publications. And recently at the Royal Institute of Philosophy, Tim gave a paper on the topic we're going to hear now. I'm not sure whether it's yet in print, is it?
No.
I think hopefully that
we'll be getting something pretty similar here, though. So
yeah.
don't worry that you've missed out.
But if you want to follow it up with the written version, it'll be out shortly, or you can. I think it is on the website with the more detailed version. Okay, good. Well, without further ado, philosophical perspectives on fine-tuning.
Thank you very much. Yes, so the title is a philosopher's perspective on anthropic fine-tuning, and it is just one philosopher's perspective. I don't claim to speak for philosophy more generally, but it is at least my perspective as of just shortly after 1 on the 26th of October. See if it's yours by the end. I'll start by indicating how I'm going to be understanding a couple of crucial terms this afternoon. What I shall be meaning when I talk about the universe and what I shall be meaning when I talk about God. By the universe I shall mean the physical reality that we encounter in everyday life, we presume, and all things causally connected to it which admit, at least in principle, of scientific explanation. So I shall mean to include by the word universe not merely the observed universe but also the unobserved sections of space-time beyond our light cone. If, as the Everett interpretation of quantum mechanics suggests, each time a quantum state collapses, as the rest of us might put it, each time a state collapses, the universe branches, then all the branches taken together make up one universe in my sense of universe. Similarly, if the Big Bang was caused by a collision of higher dimensional membranes, then the membranes et al. Are collectively the universe, and so on. I won't labour the point with more examples, but the point being that, as I shall be using the term, the word universe includes all and only entities that will be made mention of in a completed science, or be derivable from the entities made mention of in that completed science. By God, I shall mean the God of classical theism, a supernatural person who is omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good, creator of everything other than himself, and so on. I take it that the existence of such a God is a logical possibility, and I also take it that were God to exist, then he would of necessity not be a part of any universe, as I'm using the term, because were he to exist, he would by definition lie outside the universe, lie outside scientific explanation, even in principle. The God of classical theism is by definition the creator of everything other than himself, so if he exists, he is by definition the creator of our universe, whatever its nature may be, branching, bubble, etc., and of any other universes that there might be too. This afternoon, then, I'm going to give my perspective, which is indeed, as I've said, just one perspective on the following issues. The probability of every possible universe being actual, what I should call the maximal multiverse hypothesis, its probability relative to that of God's being actual, the God hypothesis, if you will, and their relative probabilities on the evidence provided by certain general features of the laws of nature which we take to be operative in our universe, what might be called the fine-tuning of the universe to us, and then in the latter half of the paper what I call the fine-tuning of us to the universe. And I'll explain what I mean by fine-tuning and us as we go along. As well as considering the relative probability of these two hypotheses on this evidence, the evidence provided by fine-tuning as I'll describe it, I'll also be considering the probability of the evidence on these hypotheses, as that is, I take it, relevant to their relative satisfactoriness as explanations of that evidence. So, in considering these hypotheses, I'm allowing myself then to think that in principle the probability of various explanatory hypotheses which make reference to things outside the universe could, specifically other universes or God, those will be the things I'm focusing on, the probability of these hypotheses might be raised or indeed lowered by our discovery of features of this universe. And this is an assumption which would raise some objections. Some philosophers would have a very different perspective on the legitimacy of this, for sure. So some are very chary of talking of probabilities in this area, for they hold exclusively to a frequentist understanding of probability, thinking that whenever one talks of probability, one is gesturing to a series of trials and talking about the relative frequency of a certain outcome across that series. Where that sort of background is lacking, such people would say, attributing probability to a hypothesis doesn't really make sense, or perhaps makes sense but is something for which one can have no good reason. Obviously, in the case of the hypothesis that there's a God, or indeed the hypothesis that there's not a God, we can't talk of the probability of such hypotheses being true, they'd say, because we don't have that sort of background. We can't stand back and look at, say, 1,000 universes and see of those 1,000 that 900 are created by God and only 100 are proved facts. Thus, they'd say, were we able to do that, we would have been able to conclude that it's 90% probable that God exists on the evidence provided by the existence of this universe, and only 10% probable that atheism is true on that evidence. But as we can't do any of that, standing back looking at the series of trials, as it were. We can't talk of probability here, or can't talk about it with good reasons. Well, that's certainly what some people say, but I contend that it rests on an overly restricted notion of probability, fine in its own context, but just overly restrictive. To see why, engage in the following thought experiment with me, if you please. Indeed, even if you don't please, engage with it. Otherwise, what's coming will sound more ridiculous than it used to. Suppose that scientists had discovered that the universe was composed of a certain type of fundamental particle, and each one of which had inscribed upon it, in Times Roman 0.00000, very tiny size font, this particle created by the god of classical theism. What would we say to someone who, on being made aware of this discovery, said this: my notion of probability is such as to mean that I cannot allow that this evidence raises the probability of theism, for it does nothing to allow me to stand back and look at multiple universes, observing the frequency with which this property is conjoined with God, frequency with which it's conjoined with no God, and working out the ratio. Well, we'd surely say that they've just shown themselves to have an overly restrictive notion of probability. That sort of evidence, had it been forthcoming, really would have raised the probability of there being a God beyond any reasonable doubt. And anyone whose notion of probability is such as to mean, not only would they say it didn't raise the probability beyond reasonable doubt, but they didn't raise it at all, would be someone who have shown themselves to have an overly restricted notion of probability, something which we had ipso facto good reason then to reject as exhaustive of legitimate notions. Now, we'll all have noticed that we're not actually in a universe where scientists have discovered that written on every fundamental particle is an unambiguous message that purports to be from the Creator. But we are in a universe where scientists have discovered lots of other interesting things, as have philosophers, you might be surprised to learn. And some of these, I suggest, have a bearing. Let's think about the scientists first. Scientists tell us that had the Big Bang had slightly more force, then the universe would have expanded at such a fast rate that no stars, planets and so on could ever have formed. Had it expanded slightly more slowly, everything would have clamped back in on itself under gravitational attraction, again before life could have formed. As well as that which controls the force of the Big Bang, there are a number of other quantities in the laws of nature, and scientists are approaching consensus on what are the maximum deviations in these quantities that would nevertheless have allowed life to have formed. Thus they tell us, here I rely on the work of others, the cosmological constant could only have deviated by a factor of 1 over 10 to the power of 120. The ratio of electrons to protons by 1 over 10 to the power of 37 and so on. I don't give more examples here, but there are, I believe, currently thought to be about 20 of these things. Of course, some of these things may be shown in future to be derivable from others, or 2 or more from something more basic than any of them, but we'll be left with at least one, it seems, in a completed science. And I have a little note here which talks about the many good discussions of these things and recommends in that context a book which I notice is on the desk here, and the author of which I notice is in the front row, Rodney Holder's 2004 book, God, the Multiverse and Everything. So there you go, you can read about those things there. We may thence be led to picture in our imagination our universe as one among many possible universes, in each one of which the same natural laws operate, yet in only a very few of which is life possible, as in only a very few of which do these constants manage to hit just the right values, thus concluding that our universe is fine-tuned to life. Universes which permit life are uncommon, we might say, in the immediate wider landscape, as we might put it, of other possible universes with the same laws, but with different constants. And the fact that our universe has just hit these right values is something, it might be suggested, which needs an explanation. An explanation best provided is often been suggested by the God hypothesis, thus the fine-tuning version of the design argument. By far the most common objection to the fine-tuning version of a design argument may be put as follows. Fine-tuning can't be in need of explanation because we couldn't observe a universe that wasn't fine-tuned in the way that ours is. We wouldn't be here to think about it if it hadn't happened, so the fact that it has happened isn't worth thinking about. This, despite its almost universal appeal, is, I take it, shown to be misguided by thought experiments such as the following, which I adapt from my colleague Richard Swinburne from Oxford. A terrorist ties you up in a room with a machine. The machine is linked up to a bomb which will, if it explodes, kill you. You see the terrorist put 10 ordinary packs of cards into the top of the machine, and he tells you the machine will thoroughly shuffle these cards and then select 10 at random from the thoroughly shuffled pile. It will drop those 10 into a little tray on its front. Only if the 10 it dishes out are all aces of hearts will the bomb not go off. The machine whirs away. The first card comes out, it's an ace of hearts. The second, another ace of hearts. The third, ace of hearts, and so on. In fact, all 10 are aces of hearts. The machine goes silent, the bomb disconnects itself automatically, and you've survived. This would require some explanation. The chances of 10 aces of hearts being dished out in a row if the machine worked as the terrorist said it did are very small. And the fact that something very improbable has happened needs explanation in terms of something that will make it less improbable. For example, the machine selecting cards on a basis which actually gives it a preference for aces of hearts. If the terrorist came in and brushed off your survival as not needing an explanation, as not being a fact which gave you reason to suspect that the machine didn't work as he'd said it did, then you would give him a shorter shrift than you'd been inclined to be giving him qua terrorist anyway. It may be true that you could not have observed any other outcome, but another outcome was, if what the terrorist told you was correct, far more likely. So if in fact you survived, you have reason to believe that what the terrorist told you was not correct. The machine doesn't work as he's described. Similarly then, if there were nothing if there were nothing outside the universe, there would be no process selecting values for these constants which have to be finely tuned for life to be possible. The fact they have the values they do would be a matter of chance. That is a possibility. But then the probability of their coming out in the way that they have would be fantastically small if this is their own one and only universe, the one and only chance they get. It's far more likely then, so the argument goes, that there's something outside the universe, in some sense selecting these values. From the fact that the universe is fine-tuned to life, one has reason to believe there's almost certainly a fine-tuner. At this stage, another objection is usually raised. If the machine had dished out what we'd all think of as a random selection of cards and the bomb gone off as a result, then that state of affairs, the bomb being set off by just that particular selection of cards, would have been just as improbable as the state of affairs of its ending up not being set off by a selection of cards being 10 aces of hearts. Yet one would not say that the bombs being set off in that manner, by whatever particular selection of cards that was, one wouldn't say that the bombs being set off in that manner needed an explanation. Or if one thought that even that would need an explanation, then that would be because of some more general feature of it, for example, it being a contingent happening, and due to one's holding approvingly in one's mind something akin to the principle of sufficient reason that contingent happenings need explanation. But to go down that road would take one outside the field of the design argument and into that of the cosmological argument. To stay an argument from fine-tuning then, the improbable feature that one takes to be evidence of fine-tuning has to be special by reference to a standard of value, specialness, that is objective enough to mean that it would have obtained regardless of what had happened. This, I think, is a more powerful objection in that it reveals an assumption which is more controversial, and even I, who think it's a fine assumption, can see arguments against it. It reveals a controversial assumption on which the argument rests. The proponent of the fine-tuning argument may, however, perhaps at first blush, reply to it by saying that surely life is special, so what's the problem? Well, sure, not the life of slugs and beetles, but the morally sentient, conscious life of significantly free agents such as ourselves. A title under which I'm speaking suggests a focus on humans, anthropic fine-tuning, and I shall indeed so focus. But the crucial features here are not by definition restricted to humans. This isn't anthropocentrism in any problematic way. Any creatures like us, Martians, Venusians, others who were like us in being, morally sentient, conscious and significant and free, would also be special in the way that we take ourselves to be. That's another assumption. You might not think of yourself as morally sentient. Hard for me to believe that you don't think of yourself as conscious. If you think that you don't think of yourself as conscious, you've got already an argument for your own incoherence building up. Anyway, significant freedom, though, that's certainly more controversial. Lots of people without apparent self-contradiction believe they're not significantly free. But let's suppose we are. The assumption on which the argument rests, then, is that we in this room, in virtue of being this sort of thing, morally sentient, conscious, significantly free creatures, in virtue of being that sort of thing, simply are more important than a similarly massive collection of non-sentient, not unconscious, non-agents, for example, a pile of rocks lying on the surface of a desert somewhere. That's why, if a meteorite were to hit this room this afternoon and destroy all of us, it would have destroyed something more important than if it had hit the desert and destroyed the pile of rocks. Anyone who really didn't believe that rocks were less important than life of our sort would be someone who didn't know what, or rather who, to prioritise saving when fire engulfed both an orphanage and a geology museum. And I don't think any of you are people who would really be put into a quandary about how to prioritise your efforts in such a situation. So such a response, whilst I would maintain in every respect true, would not go far enough to ground the argument. The universality of at least some values, by which I mean their holding throughout this universe, need not be questioned by the opponent of the fine-tuning argument pressing this objection to it. The point at issue here is the putative trans-universality of the value of life of the sort we're concerned with. It's holding across universes. Remember, in the case of the 10 aces of hearts needing an explanation, they did so because the outcome was special by standards which were objective enough to have obtained, regardless of what outcome had obtained. In other words, the opponent of the fine-tuning argument may concede that, say, significant freedom for morally sentient creatures such as ourselves exists, and it's a good everywhere in the universe where it exists, and its relative absence is bad from those sections of the universe in which it's absent. Might concede all that for the sake of argument, whilst maintaining that its absence from, for example, a universe consisting of just one hydrogen atom isn't a relative deficiency in that universe. After all, it's certainly not bad for anyone in that universe that there's no significant freedom there, because it's not bad for anyone because there's no one there for whom it can be bad. So the trans-universality of some values is then, I admit, less obviously correct than the universality of at least some values, but I believe it is correct nonetheless. We can, I suggest, see that a universe consisting of only one hydrogen atom, for example, would have certain good features. It could be imagined to have a certain simple beauty about it, although of course there'd be no one in it to appreciate that beauty indeed. There'd be no suffering in it, that would be good. There'd be no shameful viciousness or willful ignorance in it. But there would equally certainly be certain bad features of a universe consisting of only one hydrogen atom. As I say, there'd be no one in it to appreciate the beauty it had. That would be a relative deficiency. There'd be no pleasure in it, no justifiable pride, virtue, or knowledge in it. And those would be trans-universal standard bad features of such a universe. That, in any case, would be my view. It is controversial. It would certainly not be the perspective of all philosophers, probably not even that of many philosophers, but it is my perspective, and whilst I'll be happy to defend it further in questions at the end, or discussion, for the moment I'm going to proceed on this assumption. Even on the assumption that life of our sort is trans-universally valuable, I'd contend that so far the proponent of the fine-tuning argument hasn't given us reason to posit any extra universal fine-tuner. Were our universe, in fact, one where each of the values of what are then somewhat misleadingly called constants is in fact tried out, as it were, somewhere or somewhen, if you like, what I previously called the wider landscape of other possible universes would actually be encompassed within this universe. They wouldn't just be possibilities, they'd be actualities. And thus the fine-tuning of which I've so far made mention would disappear. Perhaps ours is an oscillating universe where each big bang is the other end of a big crunch or big bounce, and the curvature of space-time is gradually altered with each crunch and bang or bounce towards being life-permitting. Perhaps the higher dimensional membranes are multiply colliding, or bubble sub-universes frequently emerging from the mother universe, each trying out, as it were, one of the possible values that we misleadingly then call constants, each of the possible values that they maintain. In any of those cases, the fine-tuning spoken of so far would not need an extra universal, outside the universe, in my sense of universe, fine-tuner. It's this very fact that explains the attractiveness of views of this sort to some scientists. Confusingly given my use of the term universe and multiverse, these views are sometimes called multiverse views by their proponents and detractors. According to some such scientists, the fine-tuning of the force of the Big Bang, for example, does need an explanation, but it gets an explanation that doesn't posit anything godlike from the fact that this wider universe in the sense of my sense of universe, sometimes these people will call this wider whole a multiverse, this wider universe has parts which instantiate each of the different values that the relevant constant can take, and the same thing goes for other constants. If Swinburne's terrorist, who you remember from earlier, tried his machine out enough times to make sure that every possible series of 10 cards was eventually dished out, then of course one of his victims would eventually end up surviving. Such a view might seem to make fine-tuning disappear, but in fact it merely relocates it to a higher level. If the universe as a whole, in my sense, creates sometimes subsystems randomly or in an evolving way such that a life-permitting subsystem, whilst improbable in any particular instantiation or oscillation, whatever the word is, becomes a statistical certainty, let's say, over the range, because it's an infinite range, there is still fine-tuning, and it is still a general feature of the universe that it permits, in principle, life-conducive space-time subsystems to come into being, rather than confines what may come into being to parameters that necessitate lifelessness at each instantiation oscillation. Thinking in terms of our imaginary persistent terrorist, the fact that he feeds 10 packs of cards into the top of his machine on each occasion he tries it out, rather than, say, 9, which would then have rendered it impossible for anyone to survive it, however many times he tried it out, permits, the fact that he's feeding 10, however, permits, indeed over an infinite number of runs, makes a statistical certainty of the victim surviving. But there's higher level fine-tuning even here, in that he is feeding in 10 each time, rather than 9 each time. So there's another hypothesis that suggests itself as the natural extension of the one we've just been considering. It pushes one step further out. On the hypothesis we've just been considering, the universe had one set of natural laws, but varied in the values various constants in inverted commas took in subsystems within that universe. A natural extension of this hypothesis, which I call the maximal multiverse hypothesis, could be called the unrestricted multiverse hypothesis, asserts that every possible universe is actual. The higher level fine-tuning which remained on the previous hypothesis disappears on this one. The maximal multiverse hypothesis explains more then. As well as explaining why the constants are as they are, the answer is they're everywhere they're every value they can be somewhere. Explains where. It explains why the natural laws are as they are. They're every form they can be somewhere. Thus, it is preferable. The moral of the story so far then might be summed up as follows. On the assumption of the transuniversality of the value of life of our sort, you should think that the fine-tuning of the universe to this sort of life needs explanation, and if you're going to believe in a naturalistic explanation of this fine-tuning, you should believe in the maximal multiverse hypothesis. What I'm suggesting then is that an infinite number of infinitely variable universes would explain the existence of the fine-tuning we've hitherto discussed at all levels. If you're a terrorist who can link enough devices to enough other devices according to enough principles, you'll find yourself trying out a bomb, 10 ace of hearts card setup, such as Swinburne's, infrequently to be sure, but an infinite number of times to be sure too, and thus a victim will now and again survive. If you stick enough animals in front of enough pieces of equipment, then sure you'll get a frustrating proportion of bees in front of typewriters and monkeys in front of beehives, but you'll occasionally get a monkey in front of a typewriter, and if you do it enough times, this occasional happening will ultimately have to lead to Monkey Shakespeare. So it is a certainty that in a maximal multiverse composed of an infinite number of infinitely variable universes, somewhere in the maximal multiverse there'll be a universe like ours. At this stage then, we appear to have two reasons, I suggest, for supposing that the maximal multiverse hypothesis is a better explanation of fine-tuning of our universe than theism. First, and most obviously, on it, the probability of our universe existing is 1. Given that on the hypothesis every possible universe exists, so on the hypothesis our universe, being possible, has to exist. Theism, by contrast, in Leibniz here, in picturing the existence of the universe as a result of a free choice on God's part, a choice which, being free, he didn't have to make in the way that he did, may be able to raise the probability of this universe existing on the hypothesis, but it cannot raise the probability of its existing to 1. Of course, we're primarily interested in the probability of the hypothesis on the evidence, not that of the evidence on the hypothesis, but as an explanation of some evidence, a hypothesis that gives that evidence probability of 1 is, I take it, in that respect at least, the best sort of explanation you could get. Secondly, more controversially, the maximal multiverse hypothesis is simpler than the theistic hypothesis. The maximal multiverse hypothesis might prima facie seem much more complicated than the hypothesis there's one universe and one God, but I suggest, and this is again just one philosopher's perspective, this is more controversial, I suggest it's not really more complicated in the way that we really care about when comparing competing hypotheses. Simplistic considerations operate on types of entity as well as tokens of a type. The maximal multiverse hypothesis is simplest on types of entity, there's only one type of thing, universes. The God hypothesis is simplest on tokens of type. On it, at its simplest, there are only two tokens, one each of two types of thing, the first God, the second the universe. I suggest that simplicity with regard to type is to be preferred over simplicity with regard to token, and thus that the infinite number of infinitely variable universes hypothesis is actually a simpler hypothesis than the God hypothesis in the way we care about. If you think you might disagree with me, consider the following. And for this thought experiment to work, one needs to sweep from one's mind the fact that one knows certain things about poppies and fields. For example, one knows there can't be an infinite number of poppies because every poppy takes up a finite amount of space, and no field can be so large as to encompass an infinite amount of space or something like that. But if you just sweep that background information to one side for a moment, consider the following. You've just come upon a field which, as far as the eye can see, poppies wave gaily at you in every direction. They stretch over the horizon in every direction, out of sight. One person with you suggests this hypothesis. These poppies never end. There's an infinite number of poppies in this field. Another suggests the following. There's a huge but finite number of poppies and at least one non-poppy type of flower in this field. Which of these hypotheses would you prefer just on that evidence, without that background information? It's a hard one to call because I think it's hard to actually sweep the background information away, but I'd suggest that you would favour the former hypothesis, infinite number of poppies, they just never end, over the second hypothesis, finite number of poppies plus one non-poppy type flower in this field. Even though the first hypothesis posits infinitely more tokens, second in positing one more type you recognise to be more complex. Each would equally well explain the data, what you actually see, poppies stretching in every direction, but you prefer the second, and I think that can only be for simplicity reasons. That, however, as I say, is controversial. Rodney Holder is writing perhaps now to the effect that it's wrong. He's certainly written elsewhere that it's wrong. I see him scribbling something on his page now. Okay. Perhaps to him or others who think, well, that wasn't at all plausible, I would say that my final conclusion doesn't rest on it being simpler, in that I ultimately argue you should reject the maximal multiverse hypothesis even though it is simpler. If it's actually not even simpler, well, that's just an extra reason to believe my conclusion is right. But personally I think it is simpler, so I think it is in the lead at this stage. So what, if anything, do I think can be said against the maximal multiverse hypothesis then? There is something, and it is something decisive, I think. Let us approach saying it somewhat obliquely by looking at a danger to which the maximal multiverse hypothesis need not succumb. It may look as if the maximal multiverse hypothesis, in making every possible universe actual, explains too much, as we might say. It might appear to suggest that whatever feature of the laws of nature was discovered and posited as giving us a reason to believe in God, the maximal multiverse hypothesizer could, on his or her own hypothesis, legitimately explain that feature by saying, well, every possible thing happens somewhere, and this is somewhere after all. If that were what the maximal multiverse hypothesizer could always, whatever the feature, by his or her own lights legitimately say, regardless of the feature, well, that would be very implausible, and in itself a reason for us to reject the hypothesis. And we may imagine a modified terrorist example to bring this implausibility out. The situation then is as in the original, except that the terrorist tells you that the machine will dish out 20 cards, selected at random from the 20 packs that he shuffled and put into it. As before, only if the first 10 cards it dishes out are aces of hearts will you live, but only if the next 10 are aces of hearts as well as the first 10 will you get a Singapore sling delivered to you to toast your good fortune. The first 10 are aces of hearts, you survive, the next 10 are aces of hearts too, and the terrorist enters mixing your Singapore sling. The terrorist can brush off your surviving by pointing out that he's used the machine an infinite number of times, what I've said so far is right he can. But he cannot brush off your getting the Singapore sling by pointing out that he's used the machine an infinite number of times. Why? The Singapore sling needs an explanation, I take it, precisely because of those people who do manage to survive, only a tiny proportion go on to enjoy Singapore slings in addition. Assuming the terrorist tried his machine out an infinite number of times, people, an infinite number of people indeed, would survive, and people, an infinite number of people indeed, would enjoy Singapore slings. But amongst the set of people who do survive, amongst whom you may safely number yourself after the 10th card has been dished out, the frequency of Singapore sling drinkers is very low. The chances of you getting a Singapore sling after you survived are the same as the chances of your surviving in the first place, and those are very small. That being so, and a Singapore sling being, I'm taking it, something which is very special perhaps in this case only to humans or a certain subclass of humans with that particular gastronomic preference, but special, the Singapore sling needs an explanation of a new sort. This must be right for a reason that we've already come across. The maximal multiverse hypothesis should not be able to leave us not requiring any explanation beyond itself, a discovery that every fundamental particle had written on it in this tiny font, this particle created by the god of classical theism. And it need not. The maximal multiverse hypothesizer can explain why such a discovery would indeed be in need of an explanation that took one beyond his or her hypothesis, by pointing out that amongst those universes which are conducive to life of our sort, the frequency of those with such a message written on their particles is very low. So the maximal multiverse hypothesizer must, but can, leave a door open to the possibility there may turn out to be features of this universe that need an explanation which takes one beyond the hypothesis, i.e. features which show the maximal multiverse hypothesis to be explanatorily inadequate. Singapore sling features, if you will. And now we've noted the door is open, let's go through it. So far we've been considering the fine-tuning of the universe to us, or more specifically to us qua morally sentient and significantly free creatures, moral sensitivity, consciousness, significantly free creatures, these being better candidates for being trans-universally valuable than beetles or slugs or some such. Let's now turn to consider the fine-tuning of us, or more specifically us qua morally sensitive and significantly free creatures, to the universe. We shall concentrate on a feature of our relationship to the universe that one need not posit is trans-universally valuable. One need only recognise that it's a feature which is valuable, indeed essential to us, and this nobody will deny. So at this stage, the assumption of a trans-universality of value is dropping out. It's a feature that's been discovered, and the significance of which has been commented on, not by scientists, but pleasingly by philosophers. Pleasing if you're a philosopher, I suppose displeasing if you're a scientist. Anyway, arguably Kant, certainly more recently Ralph Walker. The feature is the continuing tractability of the universe to the process of induction as we find ourselves engaging in it. The process of induction is the process of believing that the future will resemble the past in the broad sense that the simplest laws that can be made to harmonise with past experience will continue to hold in the future. This principle lies at the root of all action. Induction's inescapability, then, is secure. But its applicability, its continuing to work, is not, a point which Hume was first to press upon us, and which Goodman has since made all the more pressing. Goodman famously introduced to the philosophical lexicon two portmanteau words, grew and bleen, and we may define them, following him in spirit if not letter, thus. An object is grew in colour, just if it's green before time t, where time t is a particular but arbitrary time in the future, so let's stipulate it 2 seconds after I finish speaking this afternoon. An object's grew in colour if it's green before that time, and blue thereafter, blue after time t. An object is bleen in colour by contrast if it is blue up until time t, so it's blue up until 2 seconds after I finish speaking, and then changes to green and is green thereafter. Goodman pointed out that we all believe, or at least we think we believe, that emeralds, for example, are green, and thus we believe that we're thinking that the future will resemble the past when we think that emeralds will stay green tomorrow, stay green over time t. However, as he also pointed out, the evidence we've collected to date, all of this evidence of course being collected before time t, before 2 seconds after I finish speaking this afternoon, the evidence we've collected to date equally well supports the claim that all emeralds are grew. That hypothesis is equally well confirmed by the data we can collected today. Someone to whom the concepts of grew and bleen came naturally, in expecting that person who grew and bleen came naturally, them in expecting nature to continue on as it had done in the past, would thus expect emeralds to stay grew, which in our terms would amount to their expecting them to change from green to blue. But we are not such people, and it's we who get things right, get them right time after time. This is Walker. Nature keeps on working in such a way as to meet our expectations, yet our expectations are based on nothing more secure than the accident that we normally classify in one way rather than another, that we use the concept of green rather than the concept of grew. That's how he puts it. This is a remarkable coincidence, the equivalent of a continuing run of aces of hearts, a continuing succession of Singapore slings being dished up to us by a compliant universe. The most frequent first reaction to this point is to say that grew is a more complex concept than green. But A, this is not obviously so from any transcendent standpoint, and B, it is irrelevant. With regards to A, a person who had been brought up using grew and bleen would have to have what would strike them as our hopelessly time-indexed terms green and blue translated to them. So if you imagine what the grew and bleen user will think when you say to him, well, we're green and blue users. He says, what does green mean? Well, you'd have to say, well, an object is green in colour and we'd have to try our best to meet his incredulous gaze at this stage, just if it is, well in your terms, just if it's grew up until a certain arbitrary time t, 2 seconds after Mawson finishes speaking, and then blue thereafter. An object is blue, we would continue, just if it is, well in your terms, just if it's bleen up until 2 seconds after Mawson finishes speaking and grew thereafter. They would be astonished that we projected such bent predicates, as they're sometimes called, as green and blue. Why are you expecting emeralds to change colour at that time, they would ask us. Why not believe as we believe, they would say, that emeralds will continue to be the colour they always have been, blue. On hearing this, we would naturally think that our positions were precisely the reverse. It's not us who are believing that things would change, we protest, and we'd think that our fates would be reversed too. It won't be us, we'd think, who will have to say, my goodness, you blue-bleen projectors were right all along. Emeralds have changed from green to blue, or as you so wisely put it, they've stayed blue. Rather, we think, it would be them who would have to say to us in a few minutes' time, my goodness, you green-blue projectors were right or wrong. Emeralds have changed from blue to bleen, or, as you so rightly put it, they've stayed green. So that's what we confidently expect, all right. But what are our grounds for such confident expectation? Not, it appears, the relative simplicity of green and blue over blue and bleen. In any case, moving on to B, the relative simplicity, even if it could be established, seems irrelevant to our concerns. What if blue and bleen were more complex, by reference to some concept transcendent standard? What is to say that our universe will turn out to be as simple by this standard as we suppose it to be? Appeals to evolution cannot help us here, because so far evolution has, of course, like everything else science might draw on to explain anything, only operated as in the past, and thus it cannot yet have selected against blue-bleen projectors whose time t is in the future, e.g. those who happen to have their time c, set at that time, whatever it is, a couple of seconds after I finish speaking. It just couldn't have harmed any creature yet if it happened to live in one of those logically purposeful universes where everything goes along just as in the universe we suppose ourselves to be in up until 2 seconds after I finish speaking, and then takes from what from our green-blue projecting framework would seem a radical turn and would from a blue-bleen projecting framework seem no change whatsoever. It's no good saying, but we just don't live in a universe where things change colour arbitrarily. But that is precisely what is at issue. What reason do we have to suppose from this fact, which we may grant, that we don't live in a universe where things have changed colour arbitrarily in the past? Well, it would be simpler, at least by our standards, if things did continue the same by our standards, is of course true. But then what reason we have to suppose that that which is simplest by our standards will continue to obtain is just the point at issue. In short then, there could be no solution to this problem from any feature of this universe. For whatever feature this universe is posited as having and used in the putative explanation will be indistinguishable by us on the evidence we've collected to date from a feature which is about to break down by reference to our standards of simplicity and sameness, a feature the time t of which is about to arrive. So, if we cannot solve this problem even in principle with resources drawn from within the universe, if we are to solve this problem, we must go outside the universe. The maximal multiverse model posits entities outside the universe. Does it have the resources with which to provide an explanation of the continuing fine-tuning of us in this way to the universe? No, it does not. On the maximal multiverse hypothesis, as every possible universe is actual, so for every moment that passes for a creature in a universe without a recalcitrant experience demolishing its inductively based expectations, there are an infinite number of creatures in other universes who, whilst hitherto having shared that creature's happy fate, now find their continuing experience recalcitrant in the most extreme ways. For every emerald that stays green over a moment in the actual universe, there's another universe that was precisely the same as ours up until that moment in which it goes blue. In another it goes red, in another yellow. In one universe that's exactly like ours up until the moment, it turns into a glass of water. In another it turns into a banana, and so on. On the maximal multiverse hypothesis, as every possible universe is actual, so from the fact that, roughly speaking, there's an infinite number of ways one might go wrong when one believes something about the future, and only one way in which one might go right, there are an infinite number of people just like us up until this moment who are about to go wrong. On the maximal multiverse hypothesis, then, the evidence we've collected to date, through our experience, does nothing to reduce the probability of us being about to discover that we're one of the ones who is going to go wrong when we suppose that emeralds will stay green. The chances on the maximal multiverse hypothesis of the next Singapore sling being served up to us by a compliant universe are infinitely low. Yet they keep being served up to us with every moment. There's another, there's another, there's another. The laws of nature, as we've been led to think of them, continue to hold. Unsurprisingly, in that it could hardly do worse, the God hypothesis does better at explaining the fine-tuning of us to the universe. And in fact, it does much better. The reason God would create a universe which is consistently inductively tractable to its morally sensitive, conscious and significantly free creatures is easy to see. These creatures' moral sensitivity and significant freedom would be in vain, devoid of the necessary conditions for responsibility, to the extent that the world around them proved unpredictable. Of course, at the extreme, without any inductive tractability at all, creatures could not be morally sensitive, often knowing what they ought to do, or significantly free, able in principle to choose whether or not to do as they ought. So, pending a conclusive argument in favour of the transuniversality of the disvalue of lack of moral sensitivity and the significant freedom, pending that argument, we cannot draw out with confidence a reason God would not have created such a world. In a world that was not entirely inductively tractable, but just significantly less inductively tractable than ours. For example, irregularly, but perhaps on average every 5 minutes or so, the laws of nature might suspend themselves for a moment and then quickly re-establish themselves. In such a world, creatures could plausibly retain at least some moral sensitivity and significant freedom, but in proportion to the unpredictability of their world, they'd find that they would nevertheless not end up doing that at which they'd aimed, relatively frequently, and their freedom would, in proportion to their universe's inductive intractability, be evacuated thereby of its moral significance, and to this extent the world would be bad for them. So given that God had, if needs be one can say whimsically, decided to create a world with morally sensitive and significantly free people in it, he would then have a good reason, indeed overwhelming reason, to create it with natural laws that were to a large extent inductively tractable to them. The more inductively tractable, the better his reason for creating it. And I have a footnote there about how this then intersects with the problem of evil. But with that, it's time for me to conclude. So allow me to sum up and then see where I think I've gone and decide whether or not you want to follow this train of thought right to the final destination, or a light on a platform at some earlier station. The argument has progressed as follows. Initially it appeared that the best explanation of the fine-tuning of the universe, to us, a fact which did need explanation on the assumption of the transuniversality of the value of life of our sort, initially it appeared that the best explanation was the maximal multiverse hypothesis. That hypothesis raises the probability of this universe existing to 1, and it was argued is simpler than the God hypothesis. By contrast, the God hypothesis raises the probability of this universe existing to less than 1, and it was argued is more complex. However, as we went on to see, the best explanation of the continuing fine-tuning of us to the universe is the God hypothesis. On the maximal multiverse hypothesis, the probability of any universe in which there are morally sensitive and significantly free persons being a universe which those persons can more or less consistently understand through induction is infinitely small, whereas on the God hypothesis that probability is 1. As it's infinitely small on the maximal multiverse hypothesis and 1 on the God hypothesis, so these hypotheses exclude one another. If there were a God, he wouldn't have created any universes where there were morally sensitive and significantly free beings who found their universes significantly inductively intractable, and there are an infinite number of those universes on the maximal multiverse hypothesis. So the hypotheses excluding one another in this way means that we must abandon one of them and choose the other. Taking all of these things into the balance then, it's obvious which one we should abandon. We should conclude that, despite its rational attractiveness in explaining the fine-tuning of the universe to us in a more conclusive and arguably simpler manner than the God hypothesis, due to its abject failure to explain the continuing fine-tuning of us to the universe, we should discard the maximal multiverse hypothesis and instead believe in the God hypothesis. The God hypothesis is the best explanation of the fine-tuning of the universe to us and the fine-tuning of us to the universe. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Tim, for that beautifully argued paper. Now let's have some questions. Yes.
Why are you wearing a green tie? Don't resist.
Yes, please.
There's another argument you could probably apply. If you have 10 to the umpteen universes, either they are all connected in some way or else they are not. If they are not, then each one of them requires some kind of explanation, which is a lot of explaining you have to do. But if there's a connection, then that connection has to be explained, and you haven't done that. So God would be required, or something, at that stage to explain why all of these universes have some kind of connection.
Thank you. Yeah. Yes, I was thinking of them as not causally connected to one another, as putting, how could I put the multiverse hypothesis in the best light, given that ultimately I'm going to want to reject it. So let's have them not be causally
I
connected
didn't
to
say
one
causally connected. I mean, by means of some idea or something which makes them necessary in a logical way, as a theory, in other words.
Okay, sorry, I think I mistook the force of your claim then. Yes. So sorry, now I've lost your point, but I can remember agreeing with it when I thought I understood it, so perhaps I'd agree with it in a different interpretation too.
Yes.
If the universe is not inductively tractable, I don't see how anything could have evolved in it in the first place that had our kind of capabilities. And yet on what you say, it could all change completely tomorrow, but it might. So
it might.
But how would beings like us evolve in a universe which had already proven itself intractable?
Well, just as there are an infinite number of ways in which the future might diverge from the present, but roughly speaking only one way in which it will go in the fashion which we think it will. So there's a lot of ways for us to be mistaken about the future, but really only one way for us to be right. So there's a lot of ways in which the past could have converged on a state of affairs like the present, and only one way roughly corresponds to the way we think it did. So one way, if every possible universe is actual, then one way in which we could all have ended up, or our correlates, because we don't think we're in a universe where it's actual, but our correlates could all have ended up sitting in a room like this, having these sorts of thoughts, would have been for it to be absolutely chaotic, for the last 15 billion years, and then suddenly everything to have sort of coalesced, and we could get here with a load of false memories, Russell's 5-minute hypothesis and stuff, a load of false memories of stuff that's never really happened to us, but nevertheless at this stage we're up and running with the same psychological status we've got at the moment. And there have to be, because that was just, I said chaos, but you could describe the chaos in a variety of details, and you could have chaos 1, chaos 2, chaos 3, all of which led to this particular spot. So there would be an infinite number of ways in which we could have ended up in an inductively intractable universe right now in a little oasis, thinking that our universe in the past has been as it is, when we'd been mistaken. So looking backwards, there's a good reason to suppose that we don't live in a maximal multiverse as well, because if we did, the chances of us being right in believing that Winston Churchill was Prime Minister, 60, 70 years ago would be wrong. It would be fantastically small. And we think if we know anything, we know Winston Churchill was Prime Minister 70 years ago.
Andrew, at the back.
I was interested to know the way you defined the maximal multiverse hypothesis falls somewhat short of modal realism. Would you like to comment on what you want to say about the possible worlds not captured by it, other than theistic ones?
Yes. Did you ask me if I'd like to say anything about that? Because that's an easier question to answer. You're right. I've got a sort of footnote here which says everything that I was prepared to say about it. Let me see. Sorry.
So Andrew's right that you do fall short of modal realism. I mean, we're talking about all possible worlds exist essentially, but you're.
Well, the way I wonder what. Yeah. So maybe that would be the way. Would it be the case that there's some logically? Well, it all depends really how you understand the distinction between logical possibility and metaphysical possibility, if you draw such a distinction at all. And I personally incline to draw such a distinction and think of metaphysical possibility as a proper subset of logical possibility. And I think the maximal multiverse hypothesizer need only concern himself with that which is metaphysically possible. And so there would be some logically possible worlds that would not exist on the maximal multiverse hypothesis, as I, again, trying to put it in as favourable light as possible and using my own modal notions as I would cast it. But there's no need to sort of saddle him with my views about that. And if he said, oh, actually, I don't think there's that metaphysical possibility is a proper subset of logical possibility. So in fact, I'm going to say that I'm just arguing for these reasons for the view of David Lewis, which he got to through very different reasons, but we all both end up at the same spot. What do you say to me? I'd say, well, my argument will still work against you, although I hadn't really envisaged that you'd do it that way. Does that answer your question a bit?
Yes, I think it's probably
Whether what I'm about to say relates to that. I mean, it does seem that some universes are the existence of some contradicts the existence of others. I mean, I could decide to hit you on the head in one unit, but given that I've got some kind of free choice, there are different possibilities, and not all of them are actualized. Unless you say it's the real me in all the other universes which are doing the other things I could have done.
Yeah. I think that might be right, yeah.
Bob.
This is just a simple-minded question, really, but to take your possibility that everything changes 2 seconds after you stop talking, if you're giving this talk on the 26th of October 2009, and you'd had that assertion, then we know it's not true. It didn't change. And there is an infinite number of time points in the past where we know we could have done this thought experiment and things didn't change. So doesn't that mean that's already proven the case? There's been an infinite number where it didn't change. So the probability is infinitesimal that it will. Now, the counter-argument to that is that people are always saying the end of the world is nigh, and there are certain commonalities to this. It's always within a generation, within their lifespan. They've been disappointed time after time, and yet there are still people saying that. I suppose that is the counter-argument to that. But.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't myself use that. I want to sort of find myself siding with those who wear placards saying the end of the world is nigh. I hope I could find some sort of more respectable philosophers on my side. But here I think I'd find myself in the company of anyone who worries about the problem of induction really as a problem in epistemology. Even if we say that it is true that in the past futures have always resembled past pasts, we're now looking at the new case, we're looking at the future future, and we're wondering whether the future future will have that property that, for the sake of argument, then we might grant that past futures are bad. And this is a new thing, so why think that this that we've established in the past will apply to it?
Well, because we could have sat here and had this argument a year ago.
But you would then have been having it about the 27th of October, or whatever it is, 2009, and we're now having it about the 27th of October 2010, which is a different date. So I think that different date will resemble the observed date.
Just because an infinite number already got.
There are an infinite number of past dates that resemble one another, but then this is a future date, and I wonder whether future dates resemble past dates. I'm sure all the past dates resemble one another. I would agree for the sake of argument.
It is perhaps like Russell's chicken. The chicken gets fed every day, and then suddenly his technology induces that he'll be fed the next day, and suddenly his throat's cut and butchered. Yeah.
I like your argument. I don't believe in multiverse theory, but I just wondered if I was someone, and I'm not actually sure how much this might overlap with their previous point, but could it be the multiverse theory is probabilistic? So there might be 10 to the umpty universes in which emeralds don't change to blue, and there's one in which they do change to blue, and probably we're not going to be the one which changes to blue.
There are going to be, if you have enough enough universes, there are going to be a lot where it doesn't change to blue. Where it stays, let's put it this way, there are a lot where, because some of those will be ones where it changes to red, and then there'll be universes where it changes to what have you. So, but only a sort of a very small subset. I mean, it's hard to talk of sort of, how small is this set. It's got an infinite number of members, and you're taking it out of something that has an infinite number of members. But it's because there are so many colours that this emerald could change to that would surprise me, and there's only really one colour that it could change to, i.e. stay as, that wouldn't surprise me. The universes in which there's someone like me who's about to be surprised are larger in frequency across this infinite domain than those in which there's someone like me who isn't going to be surprised. So I shouldn't have any confidence that I'm not going to be surprised having observed this fact.
But perhaps to say that there might be more universes or a greater density of universes, we talk about infinite number, in which the colour is very, very close to green, such that you can't detect the shade.
Yes, yeah. So I think there are sort of legitimate worries one might have. Look, is something going wrong with this sort of, we're talking about infinities here, and we always know that generates sort of mathematical paradoxes and problems, and what you seem to be saying that because there's an infinite number here, there's an infinite number here, but this is somehow more numbers, more stuff going on in this range than in this. Whereas isn't this itself somewhat arbitrary? You could shave off, well, there's this green and there's this other green and this other green, so you've got an infinite number of ways in which you could be right about the future, because your concept of green is vague enough to encompass enough of these sorts of things. I think those are concerns, so I take that point. I think what do I say?
We're back to the principle of indifference, essentially, in terms of the only way we seem to have to put probabilities on universes.
Yeah, maybe. I think I'll have to think about it a bit more. I haven't got a reply on that.
Yes.
Whenever I hear these elegant philosophical arguments and see pictures of mathematicians covering blackboards with wonderful formulae and physicists talking about singularities and brain theories and before the Big Bang, I have an image of the chap who knows laughing his head off. I think this is pretty good evidence God has a sense of humour.
I think I'll take that as a compliment, but maybe that might consider the opinion later.
Your argument is based on precise values for those constants. Suppose those constants are actually fuzzy variables. Do you then need multiverses? I'm just thinking of the fine structure concept argument at the moment.
As long as the fuzziness is relatively tightly constrained, I suppose I could say, look, that hasn't fundamentally affected the argument. So yes, you'd still need some explanation on the assumption of the transuniversality value and the other controversial claims I made. But if that was all in place, you'd still need.
But if they have changed, they would have changed over time. That's the central argument.
So would this then be to consider a hypothesis whereby these constants then in inverted commas have changed over time, so in a number of iterations of some process or something, that would then, I think, be a variant of what the first multiverse hypothesis I considered, whereby somewhere or somewhen every value these constants can take is instantiated. My claim was that you need to move from that to explain why the laws of nature are as they are. So okay, that then would explain why the constants are as they are, because they're every way they can be eventually. But why are the laws of nature as they are? If Swinburne's terrorist put 10 packs of cards into his machine enough time, then eventually people would survive. Or eventually the number of people survive. It will become statistical certainty that someone will survive if he keeps going at it. But it's still the case that he's feeding in 10 packs of cards. And that in itself is an instance of higher level fine-tuning which hasn't been explained by positing that every set of cards is dished out eventually. And I think I'd say that'll be what even the maximal multiverse-minded person should say in response to that. Okay, but I need to go out further if I'm going to get rid of this last bit of fine-tuning. Does that make sense? No. You don't look as if it makes sense. Maybe. Maybe.
Time for maybe just one quick one.
Can I have a serious one this time?
Okay.
Using the arguments of logic and philosophy, you have tried to describe or mention or address the multiverse. Is it logically possible that such universes, if they exist, could be observed?
Not as I was using it, the term, because they can't, as I was using it, universes are causally closed from one another, so we couldn't observe these other universes. Some people are very sort of worried by this in that they then say, well, then it's very unscientific. I'm not myself worried by that claim, because I think these other universes would have explanatory power, even though it wouldn't be a causal way. We wouldn't explain in a causal way why our universe is fine-tuned. So that's why as you would have noticed, I was pretty sympathetic to the maximal or to the multiverse view, thinking it could do some explaining, even though the universes it were positing, as I was understanding, were causally closed from us. But in the end, I deviated from them and thought, no, God does better. But no, the short answer to your question is no. We could never see them. But I think we could have good reason to believe they exist, even so.
Well, I think we have to draw a close because it's reached 2 o'clock. So let's give Tim a very big thank you for a very